There is a 50% probability that we are going to see a nuclear incident before July 11th and 12th. Everything lines up perfectly. It all started about a week and a half ago when those two senators proposed a resolution that NATO would enter the Ukrainian conflict if there was any radiological incident that could possibly blow the wind in the direction of NATO countries. Of course, a nuclear incident in Ukraine. That's when all of this started. Then Zelensky starts on the mic a couple days later talking about warning us that Russia is getting ready to do a nuclear provocation at Zaporozhye. Understand what's coming on July 11th and 12th. It is one of the most significant NATO summits in a long time, because it's going to be the one that determines the direction of this conflict and how much support they continue to offer Ukraine. Ukraine has given Europe an ultimatum, and I know that sounds weird. How could Ukraine give anybody an ultimatum in the position that they're currently in? Well, that's the way the world works nowadays, apparently. Anyways, they've given them an ultimatum that if you don't give us security guarantees or a timeline, an actual timeline for a session into NATO, that we're not going to go. And if we don't go, then that means maybe we just let the Russians come in here and do what they want. And that's the end of the story. And Zelensky flies off to some island somewhere. And then guess what? Poland's got a problem. So NATO realizes this. They got to do something. Now, here is where it gets really, really suspicious. All right. Today, Ukrainian intelligence releases a report that says that Russia has told some of its staff that they need to evacuate the nuclear power plant by July the 5th. Now, they use the terms evacuate, and Russia has been suspiciously quiet about all of this. I will say, I personally think that Ukrainians are planning on doing something, and this is their final failsafe in case the counteroffensive doesn't go over well. But there's more. This is what I suspect is going to happen. General Milley comes on today, Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States, and he says that the counteroffensive is about to, gear up for full swing. And here's what I suspect may be what they're planning. They know they likely don't have the manpower. They certainly don't have the artillery. They don't have the military capability, at least at this point in time, as far as we know, as far as what we are told by the media and various open source intelligence sources. We don't know exactly what they have, but we know it likely can't match the Russians. So this is what I think they're going to do. I think they're going to try to do a significant counteroffensive in the Zaporozhye direction that might force some, I say some, limited retreat of the Russians in and around that region. Now, it's important to understand that the water levels are low. I obviously don't have a map here today, so I can't really show you. But the river, at least that part of the river, has been drained significantly. The reservoir has been depleted since the dam that was holding it back broke. That's why all of the cooling ponds in the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe that's been operational for nearly 40 years, so there's a lot of spent fuel in there. Well, now the Ukrainians are saying it's been mined, that they've mined the spent fuel. So here's what I suspect they're probably going to do. They're probably going to do a significant thrust in that direction. Maybe they're going to get some saboteurs. They're going to find a way to do some sort of explosive detonation in that region, which will be the radiological event that they need just in time for it to percolate for this summit in Vilnius and for it to be the main talking point. I mean, I can hear it right now. I can hear these 31 dignitaries from all these countries talking about the nuclear incident that just occurred and why we need to take action immediately, or some sort of, rhetorical jingle like that. That's what I can imagine is going to happen. And it's perfect because what they're going to say is, we were making this thrust and the Russians were retreating, right? And they must have did this to the power plant, even though it may not be the Russians who do it. Now, no matter who does it, we know what the media is going to say. They're going to give us a headline like this: Russia reducing personnel at Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, according to Ukrainian intelligence. That's going to be the headline. Now, in the fine print, just to cover their backs, they're going to say, it did not say why some people had left and Reuters could not independently verify the information. They bury that in there somebody. They want people to see the headline because they know 99% of people who completely lost interest in this conflict up to this point, they're just going to read that headline and that's going to be the end of it. And they're just going to walk away thinking that the Russians blew up the nuclear power plant and that now NATO needs to get involved. They need to extend security guarantees. They need to make a timeline for accession into NATO, something that was the reddest of red lines for the Russians for the longest time. This was the reason for the Minsk agreements in the first place. And they may even do some sort of Article 5 business because apparently they don't have the manpower, they don't have the weapons. Now, this is according to, they have the weapons. It's just that countries don't want to individually give them up. We're reaching the stingy phase of the conflict. And beyond that, of course, it takes training. Now, I understand that it takes training to do these things. But, you know, with a mass mobilizing campaign to train, you know, day in and day out, or to put mercenaries in cockpits. And there's a variety of different ways that they could potentially get involved in the conflict without officially getting involved in the conflict. And they've been doing it thus far with mercenaries and, you know, people just doing it off the books, not putting actual NATO country insignia into the fight. And they could probably continue to do that and ratchet it up. And the Russia knows what's going on. This is why they've been effectively targeting all of these facilities, like the one in Kramatorsk, the restaurant, where all of these mercenaries were camped out. And that one is scary in and of itself because there was no air raid sirens, as far as I know. If there was, the guys probably would have dispersed. And so they must have used the Kinzhal hypersonic missile very effectively. They took out a couple generals, apparently, and a lot of high-ranking officers, as well as mercenaries. So Ukraine is desperate, and everything is just lining up. Look at all of these red flags, okay? So they're handing out potassium iodide. They're doing evacuation drills in all of the major oblasts that might be affected by this. They're actually running CBRN drills. And for the first time yesterday, they released video footage. I was going to show it in yesterday's video, but I was concerned because anytime you show video footage of exercises and you have people laying on stretchers, sometimes the algorithm misconstrues it and it will flag the video or restrict it or whatever. So I didn't want to do that, but they actually have video demonstrating what they're doing. So they're really talking it up. The Ukrainian head of intelligence, Budanov, if he's got some kind of neck issue, it appears, because he can't turn his head. He's always stiff as a board now, ever since whatever happened. Anyways, he's saying that this is the highest risk time ever that the nuclear facility is at risk of some sort of incident, whether it's cutting the power and causing some sort of, I don't know, just radiological incident in general. I'm not a nuclear physicist. I'm not a nuclear expert, but I do know that the spent fuel rods that are in these cooling ponds, that is, you know, that's the thing that they just can't sort out. Somebody messaged me yesterday and had this theory that, well, all of that stuff has probably been moved anyways, but it would take a long time. It takes very special equipment to move all that stuff to a safe place. Where would they move it? How would they move it? When would they move it? While they're in a war zone. So there's all these questions that come to mind. But there's so many red flags right now. Whether it's Zelensky talking about it nonstop for the last few days, whether it was the Senator Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham, who are giving that resolution, proposing that resolution about how NATO is going to intervene. There is all the exercises going on. Now there's these claims by Ukrainian intelligence that Russia is getting ready to bail on the nuclear power plant. So it seems like they're setting up for a false flag. That's what it seems like. It seems like this is going to be the last-ditch effort. If they know that this counteroffensive is doomed to failure, what is the last-ditch way of showing NATO or getting NATO into the conflict? Well, it is this incident. Look what they're doing to Europe. They're putting all of our lives at risk, blah, blah, blah. We have to take action now. You have people like Liz Truss and Ben Wallace and Stoltenberg saying that they need to bypass all the typical procedures for allowing a country entry into the NATO alliance, and that they need to effectively just bring Ukraine into NATO immediately, which of course would immediately invoke Article 5 and would be World War III. So something big could come. I'm saying 50% chance at this point in time that something is going to happen. I mean, the fact that they've been talking about how, what did they say? They said that Ukrainian intelligence claims that Russia has approved the plan to go through with this. Now, one thing I will say that's very suspicious on the part of the Russians is that they are being oddly quiet about all of this. And I know their PR game sucks. That's been demonstrated throughout this entire process. They get walked on when it comes to propaganda. They just don't have good propaganda. They don't counter the Ukrainian stuff. The Ukrainian NAFO crowd has Twitter and social media on lock. They can pretty much say whatever they want and everybody will believe it. But they are being surprisingly quiet. It would seem like it'd be an easy win for them to come out and say simply that this is all false. We're not getting our staff to evacuate. It's just a typical rotation, because Ukraine is using the term evacuate the power plant for a reason. They're trying to set it up as the Russians are turning and tuck and tail, and they're running away. And as a last-ditch attempt to try to limit Ukraine's advance, they're going to blow the power plant. That would create, in the very least, a 30-kilometer, probably a lot longer, like hundreds of kilometers, thousands of square kilometers, possibly, of irradiated zone where you're just not going to be able to go into, like an exclusion zone of sorts, where you're not going to be able to do anything. And so that will limit the front to a manageable size that the Russians can manage. And then they can, proceed with defending or going on their own counteroffensive or whatever the case might be. But it's really starting to look like they're setting up for something, because this has been out of the news for a while. What motive would Russia have at this point in time, when they are apparently winning the war for all intents and purposes? They're not losing ground at a rapid rate. I mean, Ukraine is making some small gains, but nothing substantial yet. And I do say yet, because I will say I don't think that the main thrust of the counteroffensive has come yet. And I think that they will do something. But Russia stands nothing to gain by doing this power plant, knowing now what the NATO plan is going to be, that is going to be the justification that they need to come in with either everything, or that is going to be what pushes them over the edge at Vilnius. I can just hear them talking about it now. So the best thing that could possibly happen to Ukraine at this point, and I know this is going to sound very crazy, while they're handing out potassium iodide and they're doing all these exercises, evacuation drills, and they're really just talking it up. And yes, it would contaminate a good chunk of their country and possibly the river if it was done. But if it was done on a limited scale, now the question is, how would they do it? That is the question. They're saying that the Russians mined the cooling ponds, which I think is just insane. Now, according to the IAEA inspector who is on site there, he hasn't seen any of this. So that, sends up alarm bells right away that obviously the Russians are telling the truth. They don't have, any motive to do this. And you got an inspector on the ground saying that he cannot see anything. But here's what we don't know. We know that Ukrainian intelligence is very good. They have a large network of partisans and saboteurs who could even operate behind enemy lines undetected. They could even be among the Russian soldiers there. So something is going on, guys, that they're getting ready to do something. And I think that this is going to be the last ditch effort if all else fails and they aren't able to make enough ground that could substantiate a fast ascent into NATO. Then they're going to do something pretty crazy. And that's going to be it. And then it's all downhill from here. There's also rumblings, and this is another fallback plan, right? So according to Sergei Lavrov, he says that NATO is starting to mull freezing the conflict, but that this is just a ploy to try to arm up Ukraine once again. So they need to buy more time so that the Russians aren't falling for it this time. And this is why it becomes all the more dangerous. Because if the Russians aren't falling for NATO's suggestions that they should possibly freeze the conflict and have some armistice of sorts, if the Russians aren't falling for that old trap, because this is the same thing they did with Minsk, they wanted to buy time to arm up the Ukrainians. The Russians could have went in there and wiped out Ukraine in 2014. They didn't, because they agreed to the Minsk agreements and they honored those agreements. And the other side didn't, however, and they started arming up. And of course, this is the ultimate outcome. So the Russians aren't going to fall for any sort of stalling tactics anymore. And that means Ukraine probably knows this, and they're probably saying to themselves, okay, so if they're not going to get us to buy time so we can train all these guys to fly in F-16s and use all this other foreign equipment and get interoperable with NATO, then we are going to have to do something to expedite NATO's entry into this conflict, or else we are screwed. Now, what this could do potentially, if NATO immediately got involved, that could be the point. It could be, and this sounds crazy, but it could be the point where the conflict freezes. Now, I know a lot of people think it's you cannot imagine a world in which Russia is fighting a NATO country and it's not going nuclear, or Article 5 is not immediately being invoked. But Article 5 it's arbitrary. It's open to interpretation. It's not a immediate full commitment of all countries' military force at that point in time in any way, which is just dictated by NATO. Countries are free to choose still the amount of support that they're willing to provide to the affected party. So this notion that Article 5 is invoked, we all go nuclear, it doesn't really work like that. It's a stepwise process. And I think it's going to be very similar to a lot of people have thought, myself included, that with all these red lines cross up, there goes the Crimean Bridge. Where's the nuke? We're waiting for the nuke. But I think it's going to be more of a stepwise process, and it's going to be a while before it gets to that point. But I think we could very well see NATO operating in Ukraine, and I think we could see conventional warfare between NATO and Russia. And if NATO then gets the upper hand, that's when things can potentially get nuclear. That's when Russia is going to utilize nuclear weapons. Now, Ukrainian media also, to add to the flurry of red flags, has been talking about this a lot in their media lately, just about nuclear events and how to prepare, and minimizing and downplaying the threat in some cases, and being sensational about it in others. But they really are setting all the groundwork, priming the psyche of not just Ukrainians, but the Western world as a whole, to accept that Russia is about to commit a radiological crime at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear power plant with what I'm assuming is one of the largest collections of spent fuel rods, which of course is incredibly hazardous to a lot of people's health. To make matters worse, just like I predicted a few weeks ago, Poland is about to get nuclear weapons from NATO, and they absolutely will get nuclear weapons. Mark my word. There's no reason why they shouldn't. They're a NATO country. They're getting everything else from the United States, from their best tanks to F-35. So you can bet your bottom dollar that they're definitely going to get weapons. Now, one of my staff members today, and apparently, every once in a while, somebody will ask me this question who knows me. and they'll pull me aside and they'll say like, okay, so what do you really think? You know, are we close to nuclear war? Is nuclear war possible? And I basically told him this. I said that if you have a relatively stable front line in which there's fighting, there's limited skirmishes, but there's nothing too crazy going on, I think the likelihood in that type of scenario, at least in the short term, okay, at least until one side buckles in the sense that they just run out of stuff or they run out of supplies, I think the likelihood is low. But the likelihood escalates immensely whenever there's one of these black swan events, like the Wagner situation, or the tactical news, or maybe Belarus becomes unstable, or even the things that are going on in France right now. Any instability, any black swan event in any of the belligerent parties that are involved in the conflict can increase the likelihood of an accident that might initiate a chain of events that could rapidly escalate to the nuclear level. So all it takes is one, drunken colonel and a wayward missile, a missed missile. Like, the more missiles that are in the air, the greater the likelihood that one goes off its course, off its trajectory in error, and accidentally flies into Poland and kills somebody again like it did last time. There's a greater the likelihood that as desperation increases on both sides, that both sides do something in order to either get more support from their allies or do more false flag activities. Ukraine could get desperate and start doing false flag activities. Plus, you have all of the intelligence agencies involved in there. It could not even be Ukrainians who are planning on doing this nuclear provocation. But we know one thing is for sure, that whoever does it, it will be blamed on the Russians, and 99% of people will gobble it up. And, the left will get in somehow. And this is not like a slight against the left. I know the right has its own share of pro-war agenda as well, but the left will get in there on some kind of environmental, anti-nuclear thing, and Russia bad, Russia nuclear, blah, 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 see what they did, and there'll be a call to arms. There'll be some call to take action, and it will be nicely euphemistically packaged as a security guarantee, okay, or some sort of coalition that's led by various countries from NATO, but not representing NATO, or something like that is going to come about. So that's my thoughts on that. I just thought I'd share that with you tonight. I do more than just talk about the Russian-Ukrainian war, but we just haven't been releasing those videos today. But you're going to get you guys are in for a treat. We got a lot of great content coming up, that high quality preparedness content that you're used to. There's more videos coming out than I can possibly name.